There were several events that played a role in causing the Civil War, but only one was the primary cause. What set it off? The Mexican War, which ended in 1848 with the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, gave America access to new territory. But acquiring new territory is not what set the Civil War off, because new land helped expand the economical power of the nation. The land acquired from the Mexican War created tension between the North and South. An attempt to keep the interests of the North and South in balance, as Henry Clay did with the Missouri Compromise, Clay made his last effort to compromise, but he became ill, and Stephen Douglas took his place in trying to pass it. Eventually, President Millard Fillmore passed the Compromise of 1850. It consisted of 5 bills. First, California's declaration as a free state. Second, popular sovereignty in Utah and New Mexico, allowing them to choose to be a free or slave state. Third, Texas gave up land to New Mexico and earned $10 million for it in return. Fourth, the slave trade was ended in the District of Columbia. Finally, the Fugitive Slave Act, which was the most controversial bill of them all, forcing the return of escaped slaves in free states back to their owners, or a fine would have to be paid. The compromise was the primary cause of the Civil War because it created bills that were asking to be broken. It didn't solve the issue of slavery, it just pacified it temporarily, creating more tension between the sectionalist nation that came in the future leading up to the Civil War. Harriet Beecher Stowe was an abolitionist who published the book Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, an attempt to abolish slavery by personalizing the argument over the rights of slavery in her book. Although it obtained the sentiment and opened the eyes of many Americans on the immorality of slavery, a book and her character Uncle Tom was not strong enough to ignite the Civil War. Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which violated the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 created a latitude boundary, 3630 line, separating free and slave regions. Kansas and Nebraska both would have been free states according to the boundary line, but Douglas used the idea of popular sovereignty to let settlers decide whether the territory would be free or slave. His reason for this was to gain support from Southerners and to build a transcontinental railroad through Chicago. The end result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act led to an era known as Bleeding Kansas. Northerners and Southerners fought over whether Kansas was to be free or a slave state, but eventually Kansas became known as a free state. Nebraska statehood was never questioned because it was so far north that it was declared free. Much blood was shed in the Douglas Act, but if the Compromise of 1850 didn't create popular sovereignty, the Kansas and Nebraska Act would have never been passed. Therefore, it wasn't the primary cause of the Civil War. It was a result of the Compromise of 1850. Dred Scott was a slave that believed he should be emancipated from slavery because he traveled to free states with his owner, and they stayed there. Northerners didn't want slaves to be brought into their states unless they were fugitives because their states were free of slavery. But the Dred Scott decision allowed for them to be brought to free states and still be considered slaves because they were property. This allowed slave owners to bring their slaves with them wherever they went. The Supreme Court declared that blacks, free or slave, weren't citizens of the United States, creating massive tension between the North and the South. Still, this case only added on to the conflict already stirring up before, and eventually, the Scott family was bought their freedom. John Brown was an abolitionist who fought during Bleeding Kansas, creating an uprising bringing anti-slavery whites and free blacks together as they raided a government arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in 1859. He planned to give slaves the weapons stolen to attack slave owners. Soldiers under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee forced him to surrender and tried Brown for treason. He was executed by hanging. This was not the primary cause of the war because it was just another attempt to solve the problem of slavery that was not properly addressed in the Compromise of 1850. President Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, was elected into office in 1860. He had moderate views about slavery, but he made it clear that slavery could not be expanded to any new states that were added to the Union, and believed that the South was getting too powerful. Shortly after his election, South Carolina left the Union, then 6 other states followed behind. Many Southerners believed that Lincoln's main goal in office was to abolish slavery altogether. Lincoln's election was just the last straw to break the camel's back. The Compromise of 1850 was indeed the primary cause of the Civil War. Each of the other events were just pieces that were added on to the already ignited flame.